Alright guys, so it looks like while this piece is staying on, I'm going to have to find a different cooler for these. So I'm going to have to probably look online, as this piece does not come with them. But I'm just going to go ahead and put this on, back on this time, and see how well it ends up contacting the GPU. And hopefully, and it looks like I've got a good connection this time around. Yep, so that's nice and secure. But again, we're not going to have any sort of heat sinks in here, which is really disappointing. I was really hoping that this cooler would be able to clear the stock heat sinks on here, but I guess that's just not going to happen. I'm going to have to find some sort of alternative here that sort of is still good enough for the card, but ultimately clears the cooler still. Perhaps it'll still run okay because there's going to be extra fans sort of covering the area and extra powerful fans, but we'll end up having to see, I suppose, how that's ultimately going to go. So the next part that we're going to do here is, because we don't really have too much going on as far as these hot areas that they're talking about, we're basically just going to have to end up putting this guy on here, and that's sort of going to be the last step. There are a couple more things. I'm a little bit disappointed to say that, you know, we don't have any sort of other pieces here that fit properly. And so you want to take these guys now, they're little plastic tubes, and put them on here. So I guess ultimately we'll see how well that ends up clearing the card. Hopefully, you know, having this giant heatsink on the back means that we'll still be able to get good cooling temperatures off of everything. But again, it's kind of just hard to know precisely which way they want this to go. We'll just have to kind of check and see. Now, the next part here they're saying is to actually put this guy this way, which is kind of interesting to me, because most of the heat on this card, to me it seems, is actually in a slightly different area. So I don't know how well this is ultimately going to hold up, because the heatsink is only really going to be touching a certain part of the card and then just sort of sitting on the back of this with the you know, with the pad down below itself. So this is kind of interesting, because I'm guessing that this heatsink is supposed to have those VRMs on the back of the card, so that it can cool them that way, or at least additional chips. But ultimately this is the way it is, so there's not really a whole lot we can do on that front. So the next piece here, after we got everything aligned, is ultimately you are going to end up putting these guys on the rails. So you just put these on top of the screws that we had in place there. So this guy goes on that way. Got this guy. It's turning into quite a behemoth here, so I'm really hoping that it still cools. Hopefully this all ends up clearing inside of my case. We'll have to see. So now you take these little silver pieces here, and we're going to just end up basically putting them onto those screws that went right through the card. So I'm going to end up just slightly screwing them on in the beginning to try and see if I can get some even pressure going on. And something else you want to make sure here is that these little tips end up actually pointing upwards, not downwards. That's also going to be kind of important. Otherwise you're not going to get the hold that you're supposed to have. And also ultimately try and make sure that you get them in the middle if you can, depending on how you know, how the alignment works for your specific card. But in the case of this, you know, double D XFX, double dissipation that is, card, this is basically how I'm going to do it, and we'll just have to see ultimately how well that ends up holding and cooling the card and so on and so forth. And then the next thing we're going to do is we're going to take these little clips, and they have a bunch of these little screws in them, and the way you do this is you basically end up putting one on one side on the other, and it should theoretically hold this whole thing in place, assuming we can get these two line up just the proper way. You just want to make sure that it's holding things correctly. So again, this is the way it's going to go. This part holds it here, the top screw holds it right there. And I screwed up on that one, as I usually do. So let's loosen this guy up again. You apparently want to hold it in while you do this, otherwise it just ends up kind of moving all over the place. Now, one thing you want to definitely watch out for with this is basically not covering your BIOS switch on the card. That's going to be important, or for that matter, really any other switches that you may have on the GPU, as that's going to be quite a big deal. Ultimately, you might have problems later on if you do end up covering them up a little bit too much. So that seems to be on there for the most part pretty good, but I want to try and see if I can even some of this out a little bit more, but I don't know if I'll ultimately be able to. Let's see if I can put some more of these guys on, because I want this to hold as much as possible, but at the same time I don't want to go overboard on this stuff either. This is pretty disappointing in terms of overall fit. I mean, I'm having to sort of just finagle my own way of putting some of this stuff on, which really shouldn't be the case. I mean, you shouldn't have to, as the consumer, put up with doing all this additional work on a product that, is supposed to fit your card. Like, if it says that it fits your card on the internet, I guess you just can't believe them anymore, that it actually, tells you that. Because ultimately, there's so much more work involved in putting all the final touches, if you will, onto this, that it's just kind of like ridiculous. And so I guess what I'm trying to tell you guys is that there's this giant gap now between the original piece and what I've got going on here. So I'm going to have to actually back off on the other side just so I can put this guy on here, because I don't know, I don't know if I'll be able to do it otherwise. But finally, I feel like all of the pieces are about as tight as they're going to be, at least with this build. I'm still a little bit sketched out by some of the stuff that's going on here. I'm really, 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 really hoping that, that ultimately nothing is too far separated out, in the sense that, there's not parts that are sticking out like way too much. But that's not something I'm going to have too much control over. So this is the final product now, and I'm going to put it into the computer and I guess just see how it works. This is how it's going to be, and we'll find out if if this ultimately ends up running the way it's supposed to. And actually, it looks like you can... Oh yeah, okay, so that's neat. So you can actually use the fan connector that came with this to attach to your stock card. Although, I'm guessing that somehow you're going to have to figure out a way to put this cable out of the way. Alright folks, so the card is now in the computer, and there's just one last part that I basically forgot to tell you guys about, which is that there's this rail that is supposed to hold the graphics card in place, and it goes along these 4 screws and goes along here, which is why you want to have the ones that have this little extra screw on the front on that side of the card, and that's where I screwed up. But something else too is, I don't know if you guys can see it too well, but these little holders in the back here, so the problem is if you don't put them the right way, they actually get in the way of the card going in. This is on a Crosshair Formula Z motherboard with my 9590 FX 9590 CPU, and you want to make sure that those mount properly, otherwise the card doesn't slot into its spot. So what I'm going to do really quick is I'm going to move these guys around so I can actually put the card holder in place, as this is a very big, very heavy card, so this is going to be the last step before I get into the temperatures. Alright you guys, so the GPU and the rail are now installed. This graphics card barely fit in my case. I have to say I'm pretty disappointed in the build quality, because I actually had to take the Dremel to this rail to actually make it fit with my case, and even then I still could have probably Dremeled it more for a better fit. These did not line up, these through screws right here, and hopefully it runs, so fingers crossed.